Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Cooperating Technical Partners Information Exchange for this quarter. My name is Kevin. I'm the training coordinator with the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and I'm going to be with you today as the moderator of this event. But before we get into the topic at hand, which is floodway surcharge, I wanted to just provide a few brief admin comments and announcements ahead of time. So with that, I want to get into a few of those announcements. Number one being that we are recording this event, and we're going to provide a copy of the recorded video as well as a copy of the full slide deck for you. So that's going to take about a week. And that'll come with some other promised follow-up. So look out for, in about a week's time, the recording and the slides from today. So if you want to take notes and you miss something, or you just want to reference it for whatever reason at a later time, you will be able to do that, not to worry on that front. Another thing I want to mention is just sort of engagement today with you all as attendees. We've got a lot of people on the webinar today. We're not going to be able to unmute lines given the size. So how we're going to engage with you all today is via the Q&A section of the Zoom interface here. So if you have any questions or comments, please submit them into the Q&A area, and we'll take as many questions and comments as time allows. We may have a few brief questions interspersed throughout the presentation, but we'll save the bulk of all those questions and comments for the end. So if you ask a question early on and you wonder if we missed it, don't worry. We're going to try and take those at the end, but Q&A is where you submit those. And then we're also going to have poll questions for you today. So they're like just little quizzes based on the subject matter today. So if you see a poll come up, go ahead and respond to that. And then we'll close it down and move on. And we'll have 3 of those total. So 1 at the very end and 2 sort of in the middle. So that's where we're going to be at for engagement with you all today. Continuing education credits, just a few brief comments on that. You're going to be eligible for 1 CEC for today if you participate in the entire event. And if you're a national CFM who participates in the entire event, you're going to get that credit applied to your records automatically. Whereas if you're a CFM in an accredited state, you'll need to take your certificate of attendance from today and submit that to your state organization to get credit. And so speaking of certificates of attendance, that's going to be part of the promised follow-up with the recording and the slides. Is if you're eligible, we are going to send you a certificate of attendance for the event today as well. It'll take about a week or so to turn that around. And so just one last note on the Cooperating Technical Partners webinar series that we have here. If you're accustomed to these and you've attended a few before and you think, hey, I might have a good topic to suggest that might fit in line with this, go ahead and email Alan Luloff. His email's up there on the screen, and then just a few more notes about certificates of attendance and so forth. Now, with that, I would like to turn it over to Alan Luloff, who, Alan, just bear with me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then you'll be able to get into your slide deck. So if you just go ahead and hit share my screen, Alan.
Okay, so you can see my screen.
Not yet.
What's going on? You're not seeing my screen?
No, so there's just a green button at the bottom of the screen that says share screen.
I hit that.
Yep, and then you just select which screen or window you want to share, and then you hit share.
Now do you see it?
No.
We just did this.
So within Zoom, are you hitting the green arrow that says share screen? Okay. What do you see after you hit that?
I get a bunch of screens that pop up.
Yep. And then you select the one you'd like to share, and then you hit OK or share or whatever the acknowledgement is.
That's what I'm missing. Now are you seeing it?
Yes, but it's not in the slide presentation mode.
How's that?
Better. Good.
Okay. Are we good?
Yes.
All right. Well, great. Welcome, everybody, today. This is a part of our Cooperating Technical Partners information exchange that we put on quarterly webinars. And I want to highlight the Cooperating Technical Partners Subcommittee. The co-chairs of that are Dave Gannett with the state of Maryland. And they must be really important because I underlined M in Maryland. And then Joanna Rolfe with the state of Kansas. And this committee is a subcommittee is part of the Mapping and Engineering Standards Committee. And here you can see the goals at the bottom of this slide. And one of the main ones is we put on these webinars quarterly. So today the speakers are going to be myself, Tim Troutman with Charlotte Mecklenburg, North Carolina, Richard Reynosa with San Marcos, City of San Marcos, Texas, and Dave Carlton with Carlton Associates, his firm. He originally was with King County, and he's got some background material, and he'll also be presenting on some of the NAI stuff that ASFPM has prepared. So the agenda today is, the basic introduction. I'm going to be giving a little history of floodway surcharge and the impacts, and then an intro to the floodway surcharge, an outreach packet that we recently have prepared. And then we're going to go through 3 case studies. Charlotte Mecklenburg, provided by Tim, San Marcos, Texas, by Richard Reynosa, and King County, Washington, by Dave Carlton. And then Dave's going to go on and present the concept of no adverse impact, our how-to guides, and some best practices. So in the announcement, we highlighted that this is kind of related to a future conditions issue. And when people talk about future conditions, they most often think of climate change recently. And that in the riverine setting is mostly increased rainfall intensity. But there's also watershed development where there's more impervious surfaces in the watershed, and so there's more runoff. And some communities like Mile High Flood District in the Denver area actually includes that in their mapping as full build out for when they create their maps. But there's also this issue of floodway surcharge, because on the maps that a community gets, it shows their floodway, but it doesn't include the impact of surcharge. That's something will occur in the future as that floodway fringe is encroached. So it's really a future condition because it doesn't really show up in the maps now. So what is this thing called surcharge? What is the impact, and how do you mitigate the impact? Well, in a natural floodway is basically anywhere where there's moving water. So here you can see the natural floodway where there's some backwater areas that aren't included. And remember, this surcharge is based on kind of the conveyance concept. So it assumes that, as long as you don't block off this natural floodway, the flow will continue. And these backwater areas won't have much impact, but storage is a factor that is not addressed. So why was this concept established? Well, there's a report on this. James Goddard, who is the head of the Tennessee Valley Authority, kind of wrote this report to talk about the origin and the rationale. And what it really amounts to is that in the Tennessee Valley, there was very constricted kind of steep slopes. So, the only way to really develop was in the floodplain. And when they first proposed this concept of floodway to kind of prevent flood damages, they proposed a zero surcharge floodway, but they got some pushback. And in the Tennessee Valley, they said, people were saying, well, geez, if we can't develop in the special flood or the floodplain, we won't be able to develop. So they came up with a compromise. Here again, you see the hilly areas of the like the Tennessee Valley, but you have these wide areas below. So it was intended to be a minimum criteria, but it was a compromise, so they could allow some areas for development and then not have the limit to that. But it was a minimal standard. And the NFIP, after when it was implemented, it included the floodway concept to kind of deal with the cumulative impacts of encroachments. And this is a CFR that kind of identified that. And then they had this component where this says the community shall select and adopt the floodway, and basically without increasing the water surface elevation by more than 1 foot. So it took that same standard that was developed in the Tennessee Valley and applied it as a minimum national standard. And when they did that, one of the reasons was this was the 1970s, and communities really, and most modeling was done on mainframe computers, and it was really difficult for communities to kind of do the modeling themselves or even review the models. It established an upper threshold so that it limited impacts to an upper amount, which was 1 foot was deemed significant. It was something that they felt was not overly onerous to implement, so they wouldn't get a lot of pushback. And it provided some ability to develop in the relatively shallow portions of the special flood hazard area. So it was, appropriate at the time due to the lack of computer modeling that was available at that time. But they did promote higher standards. And this was an excellent provision that they included in the CFR, where they basically said any state or community could adopt more restrictive requirements, and it's encouraged and will take precedent. So there were a number of states that did adopt higher standards. Here are 8 states that have those. The top 4 were adopted with the concept of no measurable amount. At that time, when these were adopted, 1/10 of a foot was deemed a measurable amount. These other 4 were more of a compromise provision. Fairly restrictive was the New Jersey standard, but then 1/2 foot is a common compromise that was adopted, and the most recent one that was adopted was actually Colorado. And here's a quote that was in the Goddard paper, how they interviewed the states that had higher standards, and Indiana said, well, there's no really reason to develop in the floodplain because there's few topographic restraints. So they didn't feel that developing the floodplain was really something that was needed in Indiana. Illinois had a similar statement where they didn't feel properties that were originally safe from development should be impacted. So in Minnesota, when they adopted their rules, they again had that 1/2 foot I mentioned, but they also had a component that if it would increase such states where materially increased flood damage potential, that the commissioners could require something less. And they've interpreted that they would have zero surcharge floodways if existing insurable structures are impacted. And so in the Twin Cities area and very urban areas of the state, if there's development that will be impacted, they have zero surcharge floodways. The other thing they do in Minnesota is they add the surcharge to the regulatory flood elevation. So their regulatory flood elevation, which requires structures to be elevated, they elevate it to the BFE, plus they have 1 foot of surcharge. And then they add, 1 foot of freeboard, and then they add the surcharge to the top. So if there's a floodway with a 1/2 foot surcharge, it's 1.5 feet above the BFE for new development. Also want to throw out here the easement requirement that the state of Wisconsin implemented, where they did, couldn't say you can't develop. We're not going to say you can't develop in the floodway, but we're going to say if you do encroach and you do cause a rise, you've got to get an easement from affected property owners. And what's interesting about Wisconsin is not just insurable structures, but it's raw land also. We did an analysis, ASFBM funded itself an analysis to look at the impacts, look at this floodway encroachment standard. And we looked at case studies across the country, 8 case studies. And we found that on average, for these 8, if you have a 1 foot surcharge, your floodway is about half the size of the natural floodway. And the velocity goes up because you're pinching in that flow, and therefore the velocities were on average about 33% higher. So here's an example of one of those case studies where this is the full conveyance or the zero surcharge floodway. And again, this is based, this is 1D modeling, so it's based on conveyance. And there's these storage areas out to the right and the left that are not part of the floodway, where you can still build, but it does not, if you were looking at storage, it might have some impact, but since it's dealing with conveyance, it does not. Now you put a 1 foot surcharge floodway or analyze that, it shrinks in this natural floodway pretty significantly, and these green areas become kind of a green light area for developers to build with no analysis required. This is a slide from the state of Nebraska. I just like it because it's got this bulldozer pushing fill into the what was the natural floodway. The Corps of Engineers has a flood damage curves that they've developed, and I want to highlight that if it's built to the base flood elevation and during a flood, there actually will be, according to them, about 14% of the property value impacted. That goes up to 23% when it's based on a 1 foot of increased flooding. Here's another graphic that kind of highlights the issue where you've got this before development kind of concept, then you get development that occurs and filling in the floodway fringe that pushes those elevations up, and existing development that was not impacted by a 1% annual chance flood before now is at risk. This is just a photo showing kind of a stream that's with some stream bank erosion or degradation, bank failure, that increased velocities exacerbate that situation. So now we have a poll question, and I'll let Kevin, and I think I'm supposed to am I supposed to stop sharing my screen now?
No, Al, you can leave your screen shared. However, let me open the poll because you can't actually interact with the slide itself. So now you should be able to see the poll open and the options there. So just select the number of states with higher standards for floodways, and I'll give you a moment just to weigh in on that. Alan, and I hope this isn't kind of giving away part of the thing, but I had just a quick question while you're presenting is, do you know if Washington, D.C. adopted higher standards off the top of your head or offhand?
I do not.
Okay. All right, Timothy. Well, we'll maybe work on getting you an answer to that, but I just wanted to ask it quickly because it was pertinent and just kind of a quick question either way. So I'll give you a few more seconds to weigh in on the poll here, and then I'll close it down and share the results.
Just want to highlight while you're doing that, helping with the Cooperative Textual Partner Program is Laura Algio with FEMA. She's the program manager for the program, and she's been doing a fantastic job of promoting that program, and we're very appreciative of all her efforts.
All right, thanks, Alan. Okay, and so as you can see, I hope you all can see the results of the poll. Alan, can you confirm that you can see that?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
And it's
cool.
most people got the right answer. There's 8. And those 8 states are the ones that have been, and FEMA, by the way, does map floodways in conformance with the standards in those states. So in Illinois and Indiana, they map floodways with a surcharge of 1/10 of a foot. Colorado, it's a 1/2 a foot. So they're very consistent in mapping floodways in those states based on those standards. So now I'd want to go into a outreach packet that FEMA actually funded us to prepare, and it's intended to be used at discovery meetings or early in the mapping process with the community. It contains a short summary document that kind of introduces the concept of floodway surcharge. It's about 5 pages long. Could something be handed out to communities at that type of meeting and give them some background material with a pretty short, easy to read document. We also included an improved graphic to show how floodways with surcharge are developed. And I'll go through that graphic in a minute. And then a set of best practices. And we're going to go through those best practices today also. And then there's 2 sample letters. One is for a community that wants a 0 surcharge floodway, where it says basically, we're supposed to ensure that new development is reasonably safe from flooding. And with a 1 foot surcharge floodway, we really don't feel we can do that. And so we want a 0 surcharge floodway. The other one is when the community says, no, we understand that it might have some impacts. We don't think they'll be significant. We need some portion of the special flood hazard area for development. So we want a 1 foot surcharge floodway in our community. And it basically ensures they understand that there's some impacts and they're really willing to live with that. So the first document, the interior, that basically information document highlights that without a FEMA map floodway, that any development in the special flood hazard area must be reviewed, and you've got to track increases to ensure that that 1 foot threshold is not exceeded. That's very challenging for communities to do. And in some instances, you could end up with some encroachments that exceed that threshold. If with a FEMA map floodway, communities are not required to analyze the impacts of development in the floodway fringe. They are instead, they don't have to look at impact in that fringe unless their ordinance requires it, which King County's does, and you'll see that in a minute. And it does require a no adverse impact, and no rise analysis in the floodway. So the deepest and the highest velocity portions requires a no rise analysis. So here's this graphic that I was talking about. And you can see here where we've got this is a graphic that can be used in PowerPoint presentations. And it highlights that, you've got the natural floodway and you've got some fringe. Like this one, you've got that case study I showed you before, where you've got that full conveyance, 0 surcharge floodway. And then you start encroaching on that, reducing the size of the floodway and increasing the size of the floodway, the fringe. And in the models, what's interesting is they create these invisible frictionless walls to contain that surcharge. And that, is a way the modeler kind of, common HEC-RAS model, how they block off flow until they hit that 1 foot threshold. And that identifies how wide that floodway is in that area and how wide the floodway fringe is. However, that there's no, in the real world, invisible wall to contain that surcharge. So that surcharge spills out, if it's fill, if there is filled to the base flood elevation, people don't generally, unless the state or the local government requires it, fill higher than that. So anything built to the base flood elevation will start to get flooded, and it will actually go beyond that into the outside the special flood hazard area. So here's that, again, that case study showing a 1 foot surcharge floodway. And you see this red line, that's where that 1 foot would go beyond the special flood hazard area. So you can see it actually impacts properties outside the special flood hazard area. So one of the things that's being often developed are BSV +1, or in some cases BFE +1, 2, and 3, to identify what structures might be impacted just outside the special flood hazard area. And this is done for kind of to address uncertainty and address potential for climate change impacts or other impacts that are going to increase floods. I mean, one of the major issues, of course, is that FEMA flood maps are developed on existing conditions, and it doesn't address future conditions. So this BFE +1 helps document the impacts. So here in Maryland, they've did that analysis. They've got building footprints, and they have identified that in the special flood hazard area, they've got about 14,000 buildings. If you add that 1 foot, that adds almost 18,000 buildings. I mean, it increases it to 18,000 with an increase of about 4,000 buildings that would be impacted. That's an increase of 28%, and they've estimated the damages to be about $5.6 billion. So it again promotes implementation and better understanding of risk, potential for use for maybe critical facilities. So it's a useful analysis. Missouri also did a similar analysis. They did it really more for a slightly different reason, to highlight what the benefit, if you would adopt freeboard standards, how far that freeboard would extend. And they provided us with 3 counties in the state. Missouri, not quite as densely populated. And so you hear the number of structures in each of those counties that are in the special flood hazard area, how many in the BFE +1, and then the amount of increase. And you can see here that increase is about 35%. So again, a significant increase when you look at the BFE +1. So again, the guidelines talk about, the CFR, community shall select and adopt a regulatory floodway. And remember, you can work with FEMA to get additional data, such as a BFE +1 foot map, to assess the impacts. It's a more common data set that's being generated. It's not a regulatory data set, it's more of a risk assessment again. So again, the higher standards are promoted. And what we're going to talk about now in these next 3 case studies for best practices, some of those higher standards. So we're going to have another poll question.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. And let me get the next poll going for everybody. Bear with me just a moment. Okay, 1 foot surcharge floodways pinch in the natural floodway on average by what percentage? So go ahead and weigh in there.
So
Alan,
while you're
go ahead, Alan, please.
While you're doing that, I'm going to highlight that the next 3 best practices we're going to highlight is Charlotte-Mecklenburg, North Carolina, where they were a cooperating technical partner. And so therefore they were doing the mapping for their community, and they selected some higher standards that they included on their maps. The second one is going to be San Marcos, Texas, where they adopted higher standards, but their higher standards also included where the floodway was the entire special flood hazard area. And then the third is King County, Washington, where they stayed with the FEMA 1 foot surcharge map, but they adopted regulations so they would require a no-rise analysis in the floodway fringe. So they basically require a no-rise analysis in the entire special flood hazard area, but they kept the 1 foot surcharge mapping the same without changing it. Well, in general, people underestimated the impacts. Looks like about 30% did get it, that is about 50%, but many felt the impact was less and less of an impact. The right answer is 50%. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Tim Troutman with Charlotte Mecklenburg is going to present, and then after him, Richard Reynosa, and then Dave Carlton. So I'm going to stop sharing.
All right, can you see that, Kevin?
Yeah, if you could just get it into presentation mode, we'll be looking good. There you go. Perfect.
All right, well, great. Hello, everyone. Like Alan said, my name is Tim Troutman. I'm a program manager in Charlotte, North Carolina for our stormwater services utility. I'm going to be a little bit less technical in most of this presentation and focus a lot on the process, because you can have all these great ideas, but if you can't get them approved, then they just sit on a shelf, and it can be very, very frustrating. So I'm going to be talking about what and how we have reduced the adverse impacts on our floodplains and our floodway surcharge. So here we are. That's the great state of North Carolina, from the coast to the mountains. For those of you who are not familiar, Mecklenburg County, which is home to the city of Charlotte, is circled there. We manage the floodplains for 8 different NFIP communities listed on the screen, including the city of Charlotte. So our floodplain mapping involves about 350 miles of detailed study in these 32 watersheds shown on the screen. We have a FEMA, as you'll see here in a minute, a FEMA floodplain, and a community flood fringe and floodway as well. 182 panels, paper obviously, and digital forms. We're very digital centric, web delivery municipality, and so everything we have is digitally available and GIS referenced. Like Alan mentioned, we are a LOMAC review partner, a CTP, and so we process LOMACs that we get here locally, as well as our cooperating technical partner. And we also lastly have a floodplain mapping standards document that is a supplement to FEMA standards and gets into some of these floodway issues and how we require them to be modeled. So first, I just wanted to highlight what's really important about floodways. You can get very technical very quick, but the products that you produce with the maps and the messaging associated with them. If you look at the list there I have on the screen, these are our biggest users of the floodway information and the floodplain information. And you can see it, we have to meet the needs of engineers, like probably a lot of you on the webinar today, as well as the general public, you know, who is not technical whatsoever, but they see a floodway on their property. They want to know if they can put a shed in their backyard, and it needs to be understandable. So first, I'm going to walk through our maps here so you can understand what we have, and then I'm going to go back in time and tell how we got there. So this is a picture of our flood insurance rate map from 20 years ago after it was updated with this concept. There in the hatched area, you see our FEMA floodway, and it is based on a 1/2 foot surcharge. The dotted area is our community encroachment area. Our slang term for it's just a community floodway. It is basically a floodway, but it's just a community standard floodway of a 0.1 foot surcharge. There in the light blue, you see the traditional FEMA existing conditions floodplain that is mapped. And then the little sliver on the outside is our community floodplain, which is based upon future conditions. And that is our standard for development here in Charlotte. Go over You can see the community encroachment area highlighted there in the mustard color yellow. So any encroachment in that area works just like a floodway, where you have to do a study, etc. It's another way to kind of look at how the layering works, because when you add multiple floodways or higher standard floodways, especially multiple, it can get very confusing in your ordinance. And so we developed this depiction here on how it generally works. The rules and the regulations and the ordinance, anything that talks about the community special flood hazard area, it applies to the entire area, not just the little sliver on the outside, but the entire area underneath. And it does that through this whole layering process. So anything that we talk about that is a regulation to our community encroachment area, which is that dotted area, it applies to the entire FEMA floodway as well, because it goes kind of underneath, side to side. So this is a graphic that depicts that. Lastly, we have a cross section just to describe also how we do it. And you can see the FEMA floodway, which again is in our community is a 1/2 foot. The FEMA flood fringe area, which is the area outside the FEMA floodway, but inside of our community encroachment area, you see that mapped in the cross section, as well as the floodplain areas outside. So it can get very confusing, and it can make writing an ordinance very challenging, but it is well worth it if you can clearly describe these things. So now I'm going to dive into why we ended up doing this. And we're going to rewind back into the 90s when we were impacted by a couple floods. And we looked at our maps that FEMA drew for us back in the late 70s and early 80s. And we said, wow, something is not right here. Based upon the rainfall that we got and the flooding areas and the damage, something is not right here. And Charlotte was booming, still is, but was certainly booming in the 90s with a lot of growth. And so we developed a guidance document to change the way we did floodplain management. And number one on this guidance document was figure out how to better protect new development and address new development. And we were kind of charged with figuring that out. So that's the why we did, is we recognized we needed a higher, better standard that looked after new development that was being constructed. So now how we did it, and this is to me really the interesting part of the story, and the really powerful piece. This is the process that we use for a lot of things that I would say could be deemed as confrontational, have differing opinions, strong positions, people get dug in, and all of a sudden you have a mess. And this is the concept that we use and how we got 2 floodplains and 2 floodways through the community and implemented. There's 4 components that I'm going to go over briefly that are all integral pieces to this concept. One is getting facts and data, doing unbiased studies and bringing those studies and results forward. 2 is partners within the community. And the word partners is really emphasized. It's not the government talking to the people, telling them what we're going to do. It's, hey, come to the table with us. We need to figure this out together. The 3rd piece is coming up with ideas and strategies, again, not in a silo, but with the partners in the community based upon the data and facts. And then the 4th is coming up with actions and implementable ideas that, again, weave through this whole thing, that are based upon ideas from the community and the partners and based upon facts. So these 4 pieces are really important to this whole process, and I'm going to go over them one at a time before I wrap up here. So we'll start with the facts and data, which is the first piece. So what we decided to do when we had a very strong feeling that our floodplain maps were off, and we had a strong feeling that if we just kept updating them based upon the minimum standards or existing conditions, that it probably wouldn't turn out too well for us. So we did a pilot study, and we brought these facts and data together in a report. And what we found was in this pilot area, the FEMA flood elevations, base flood elevation, BFE, looked like it was going up an average of almost 2 feet in this one watershed from the maps that we had in the 1970s. That's very significant. We are not along the Mississippi River. We have urban flash flooding, and therefore, we don't have massive rivers coming through Charlotte. When we look to the future, and we did a study to look at what future land use and potentially rainfall uncertainties would result, and the average increase was 4.3 feet. So these were very eye-opening. Then we took it and put it in terms of buildings in this report. And a 30% increase in the number of flooded buildings into the living space, with future conditions about a doubling, more than doubling of the number of buildings that it would get into the living space. And lastly, if we just kept doing the same thing and updating the maps and having a 1-foot floodway, we would have more than 2,000 buildings with living space flooding at some point in the future. And that's without any development. And then lastly, we put it in terms of dollars. And if we did nothing, there would be an estimated $260 million additional damage in the watershed that we studied in the future. So very powerful number. So we got the data and facts. Second piece, we engage partners in the community. We identified stakeholders. And when I talk about stakeholders, it's all the key folks that would be impacted by any kind of a decision. So in this specific case, we brought developers to the table, we brought realtors to the table, we brought builders to the table, we brought environmental groups to the table, Sierra Club, river keepers, as well as some other leaders in the community. And we brought them all to the table and we shared this data with them. We defined objectives of the task force so that we weren't talking and getting way off course. We said, we're here to look at the future, what the future of flooding looks like in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, if we keep doing the same thing, and what solutions we can come up with to make us more resilient. We didn't say resilient at the time, but that's essentially what we were doing. 3, community values and vision. We really set forth a vision for our community that had been laid out by city council and the county commissioners. And we kind of shared that and got everyone on board that, okay, this is a common vision. And then the fourth and most important thing is we all committed to a consensus. We all committed to coming out of the process with recommendations that we could live with. And this is the most important piece of this whole approach, is gaining consensus from folks. It may not be that they like it the best. They like these solutions and these proposals the best. There's some of their constituents may not like it at the Home Builders Association, but they can live with it and they think that it makes sense. And so that's our goal, is to come out with some kind of a consensus at the end of this of changes. So the fourth thing, once they looked at the data, we had lots of meetings. We did more kind of studies within. This went on for 6-9 months. It was a long process. We bought them dinner. That was a really important piece. And ultimately, the consensus outcomes from this specific effort related to floodplains and floodways had lots of pieces to it, but these are some of the main ideas that the group came up with. One, they supported an interim 5.7-foot freeboard on top of our existing maps. When they saw the data and they really talked through all the different options, they looked out and they saw development was going on. Many of them were developers that were permitting these developments. And they realized, we don't want to build something and then in the future it's going to be over 5 feet below the flood elevation. And so they supported an interim policy to kind of stop the bleeding, because these maps take years to complete and actually study and complete. And then ultimately, they supported developing a future floodplain, a community floodplain, and a 2-foot freeboard to protect from future growth and rainfall uncertainty. And floodways specifically the compromise was a FEMA floodway that was a higher standard, which was a 1/2 foot, and a community floodway, which was a 1/10 of a foot. And that truly was a compromise as part of this project, because folks were, I don't know, folks are afraid of FEMA sometimes at the local level, and developers and builders, and they felt like if the FEMA standard was a 1/10 of a foot, there wouldn't be any flexibility. And so this was kind of a compromise. And as it turned out, we probably really didn't need 2 floodways, but it helped folks feel good about the process. Lastly is the actions and implementation. And so at the end of the day, because we went through all this process, the data, the partnerships, the consensus recommendations, what ultimately ended up happening were our floodplain regulations were approved unanimously by city council and all the towns to have a 2-foot freeboard, which is what we have now. We have a guidance document that has storage-based modeling in place that accounts for and is an iterative process as part of developing those floodways to account for lost storage. We have floodplain maps with 2 floodways and both a FEMA and a community floodplain, like we talked about. As a result of similar efforts to this, consensus building efforts, we have stormwater controls that have been in place a long time with low impact development, stormwater control measures, and a lot better land use planning that came out of this. As well as the last thing that was of significance over 20 some years ago is stream buffers. And actually backing people away from some of the streams and allowing those riparian areas to function and benefit the community in other ways besides development. And so we have a 100-foot plus buffer along our floodplains. So that is our process. The last thing I just wanted to highlight, especially since I know we have some CRS folks on the call. We did not do all of this because of CRS, but because of these higher standards and flood maps and lots of things that come out of this consensus building process. City of Charlotte was able to, with our assistance here at the county, get a class 3 CRS rating, and some of the other towns that are CRS participants, which we manage, are class 5. So that's another benefit. And that is all that I have. Look forward to the questions when it is time.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. We actually did get quite a few questions come in during your presentation, although we still have a couple more case studies. So I want to make sure that the rest of the presenters have enough time. So I think we'll go over to Richard. Tim, if you want to just stop sharing your screen, and then Richard, you can share yours and we'll roll right into that, and then we'll kind of take questions at the end.
There you go, Richard, on to you.
Okay, am I up and running?
Yes, looks good.
And I'm on the wrong slide. All right, great. Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, good day. Again, I'm Richard Reynosa, Assistant Director of Engineering with the City of San Marcos, Texas. I'm going to give you just a little bit of background, kind of leading up to some of the changes standards that we implemented in San Marcos. San Marcos was established in 1877. Our population is approximately 67,000 people. The springs, these are pictures of a couple of the San Marcos springs, and is the reason why San Marcos is perceived to be continuously inhabited for the past 12,000 years. Where is San Marcos? We sometimes get confused with San Marcos, California, and we are in Texas. So we are located about halfway between San Antonio and Austin, about 30 minutes to Austin, 45 minutes to San Antonio. A lot of development is being expanded from those two metro areas, and so we're definitely challenged with some big city problems here locally. Again, our location in Texas, we get cold fronts from the northwest, and we got the tropic from the Gulf of Mexico and moisture, and with all of that, this corridor is perceived to has been labeled Flash Flood Alley. San Marcos is located in the Blanco River Basin, and that stretches all the way out to the coast. And so we see quite a bit of high volume storms and flood events that have occurred over the history. A little bit more in San Marcos. This gives you kind of an idea of the floodplains across our jurisdiction. The shaded area is the San Marcos city limits. The purple outline is our ETJ, our extraterritorial jurisdiction, which goes out into the county, but we have some regulations that we're able to review and enforce in there as well. So the right image kind of zooms into towards the center of the city, and we have, again, quite a bit of floodplains covering the area. We have the Blanco and the San Marcos River that converge with a number of creeks, all creating floodplain within San Marcos. And this is kind of gives you a history of all the different flood events that have occurred over time in San Marcos. We've definitely seen quite a few, even since 2015, which this list stops at. We've had a few more flood events. Back in the 60s, 70s, the floodplain was even larger than what you saw there before. And there was 5 dams constructed upstream of San Marcos. And even with those 5 dams, you still see the floodplain as great as it is. And back in 2014, the city of San Marcos partnered with a couple of jurisdictions to remap our floodplains. At that time, our floodplains were based on 1990 data. We had a digital firm, our FEMA effective maps were, and still are actually, 2005 effective floodplain maps, but the data behind it was in the 90s. So in 2014, we partnered with a couple of jurisdictions, the county, to remap our floodplains, update the studies and hydrologies, and really put forth the effort to updating our maps. And typically when you're doing that, a lot of the engineers, the modelers want a storm event to calibrate to. And so be careful what you ask for, because in 2015, some of you locally may recall we had a Memorial Day flood in 2015 in the Blanco Basin. And this was a pretty significant storm. It started over the upper drainage basin of the Blanco River Basin. Basically, a cell sat over this area and just dropped nearly a foot and a half of rain over a 4-hour period. And you can see the cell here, and then it came down. San Marcos is located down in this area. So we didn't quite have the storm event that we saw upstream, but again, this basin feeds directly into San Marcos. So again, the storm event started in the city of Blanco, and downstream of the city of Blanco is Wimberley, and then San Marcos. And so these are 2 flood gauges, and you can see the increase. This was a flash flood. If you want a definition of a flash flood, this was a flash flood. And within a 45-minute time period, the Blanco River rose by over 20 feet. Here in Wimberley, and then again in San Marcos. And if you may not be able to really see these fully, but the time period in Wimberley was from 10 to 1 a.m. at the crest, and then further downstream in San Marcos, it was approximately 2:30, almost 3 o'clock to about 5 in the morning. So this was really the worst conditions, overnight flooding, limited visibility. It was really just devastating. And so this is a couple images. The background image is in Wimberley, the Blanco River. These supports were a bridge holding up a street. The flood just knocked the street completely over downstream into the Blanco River. The small image to the right shows roadway out into the river. And then these are a couple of more images of just the devastation that was brought through the Blanco River. On this background image, you can barely see it, but there's some structures back there that were shifted off their foundation and moved. I think these were moved maybe 30, 40, 50 feet downstream of their foundations. So locally, we saw, all that floodwaters came down to San Marcos. The devastation wasn't quite as severe. There was just a lot of local flooding. The rivers rose, and many people were impacted. Again, from the local level, there was a lot of concern. There was a lot of look for what to blame on the damages that were created. And unfortunately, there was a development that was under construction that was highly contested on being permitted, and they were situated right at along the San Marcos River. And because of that, they were kind of the bad guy, the scapegoat for a lot of those discussions. And so with this flood event and a following one in October of 2015, there was a lot of outcry from the community, city council support for increasing our higher standards. What can we do to regulate development and make them responsible for not creating any impacts? And so again, there was support from the community. There was a perfect storm. The community was supportive, the city council was supportive, and at the time, the development community kind of kept their distance. And so there was a lot of support to implement higher standards, and so that's what we did. The higher standards that we implemented, we brought to city council. There's discussions at city council level just on what can be done, and then we brought forward some detailed discussions on these aspects, and then so there's a number of city council meetings. We implemented fill standards, compaction, type of fill, access within the floodplain, construction standards. One thing during construction is that you can have your existing conditions and your proposed construction complete conditions, but during construction and the development we were looking at was perceived during construction to have an impact to the way waters flowed through the area. So there was a change in conditions during construction that wasn't fully modeled from an existing or proposed condition. And so at the time during construction, the development was perceived to act as a dam and not let floodwaters flow through as proposed in the final condition. So we implemented construction standards, material storage, compensatory storage for any loss of volume in the floodplain. We adopted a flood model, and that is basically to kind of bridge the gap between your FEMA effective maps and any changes to those maps. Before this, we were regulating off FEMA effective maps, which again, as I explained, it was severely outdated, due for an update. And so we essentially adopted a flood model so that we could regulate based on that from a city local level. This also helps us when concurrent developments are going on. And so even if a single development hasn't submitted a letter of map revision for their development, in some parts of the city, we could have two developments going on at the same time. And so we want them to count for each other. And so that flood model helps us regulate from that standpoint. We increased our freeboard from 1 foot to 2 foot. And then I want to talk a little bit more about the floodplain buffer and no rise. I mentioned also that we started a study in 2014. We had the flood event in 2015. With that flood event, FEMA ended up taking over that flood study in 2014 and put some more money behind it, made it, rose it to a higher level and was able to issue advisory based flood elevations to get us some better information within I want to say it was within about 60 days after flood events. So as people were rebuilding, recovering from the flood, they weren't building back to their existing conditions. They were able to implement some of these higher standards, but also elevation requirements so that they would be protected from future floods. And so the floodplain buffer that we, like you've seen in some of the other maps, exhibits, is that you have your floodplain limits, your floodplain boundaries, and you have a base flood elevation. And so if a existing home within the floodplain has a substantial improvement, or they remodel or need to raise their foundation, they have to meet our freeboard requirement of 2 feet. So essentially they have to raise their home to that higher protected area. Our floodplain buffer extends that 2-foot elevation out beyond the limits of the floodplain, such that structures that are outside of the floodplain would be regulated or also required to elevate to that same 2-foot elevation. That was something that we wanted to ensure, that we were protecting homes outside of the floodplain to the same elevation standards of those within the floodplain. So that floodplain buffer helps us do that. And so getting into our no-rise floodplain, as I mentioned, FEMA kind of got on board with our flood model and was implementing the updated hydrology H&H that was done to update our maps to the current data. And so we implemented a no-rise floodplain. We required anyone within the floodplain to analyze the extent of the impacts, provide mitigation for those impacts, and then show that there's no rise in the floodplain. No rise is not detailed in our ordinance. It varies really. You know, you have a 1D steady state model, unsteady, 2D models. If you run all of those on a particular development, you're going to get different results. And so we try to work through those different analysis and showing a no rise to the extent that we can. You know, we could debate for a while on what that is. Is it 0.01? Is it 0.001? We've struggled that with, like many jurisdictions have, on what that actually is based on the type of models and the data that we have. But the intent is that it's a no rise floodplain, and that's what the goal that we're trying to achieve. And so as FEMA was remapping our floodplains and with the no rise ordinance in effect, they were coming up with challenges. The initial intent of the remapping of our floodplains, it wasn't just the city of San Marcos, it was Hays County, or it was multi-county flood analysis that was being done, remapping of floodplains. And so they were going through the typical process of identifying the 1-foot surcharge floodway. And as I mentioned, the complexity within San Marcos, with a number of rivers converging and a number of creeks converging as well, they were running into some issues on that floodway analysis. The San Marcos River has a floodplain, but when it converges with the Blanco River actually backs up into San Marcos and back into the city, and then also up 2 creeks, Purgatory and Willow Springs creeks. And so it was definitely complicated. We did have a 2D model, which helped us better understand how those floodplains interact with each other. But from a mapping perspective, there were still challenges on delineating your typical floodway. So FEMA came to us, their consultants came to us, was explaining the issues, and at the time they suggested and brought up what San Marcos consider showing our special flood hazard areas as the floodway. Essentially, all of our 100-year floodplain would be shown as floodway, and we did not see any issue with that. We actually were open to the concept. We felt like that would provide greater awareness and then also be reflective of the higher standards that we adopted and were implementing at the time. And so that's what has been moving forward. Here's an exhibit. As I mentioned, this analysis was also throughout a couple counties. And so here within San Marcos, you can see the blue striped area is our floodway. And this is encompassing all of our 100-year floodplain. This orange yellow color is the 500-year. And so that's still out of your floodway. But all of the 100-year 1% chance flood is delineated as floodway. And then here to the right, this dashed line is our city limits. And so as you get out of the city limits, they do have your typical floodway still delineated. The counties were not on board with showing it all as floodway. They did not have those standards in place. And so it's a little bit confusing as you go in and out of the city. Here's a situation where you have city limits on either side, and you have the county that's showing your typical floodway, and then you get into the city limits, and then it's all floodway. Here's a FEMA map, a firm map. Again, on this side, this is the Blanco River here, and basically the city limits is the center line of the Blanco River in this location. So to the left, the floodway is all of the 100-year flood, and on the right side, you have floodway, your flood fringe area shown within the county. So some of the pros and cons of this, kind of the lessons learned, and we're still learning some of the lessons of implementing this. The pros for this brings awareness. When you see floodway, it's more alarming, and so it brings awareness that something needs to be done. There's caution to developing in this area. In some cases, it's discouraging and limits the development. And then, as the code requires, it requires an analysis. There's no longer the allowance to fill the fringe without doing analysis of what the implications are, filling that. The cons, again, it's alarming. We get a lot of people feel like we're doing a take of their property designated in as floodway, but we just have to explain. A lot of the cons need explanation. We explain that it's not a taking of your property. You can still develop the property. You just have to show that you're not creating a rise. You got to mitigate. So it's not, we don't prohibit development in the floodway. You just have to do the analysis and mitigate for that. And it gets a little bit confusing. As I mentioned, you go in and out of the city, it looks different. It doesn't make sense until you get that explanation. And so it can be a little bit confusing. Insurance as well, although they typically don't vary insurance rates from floodway versus flood fringe, but can be confusing when an insurance agent's looking at the maps. One of the biggest cons, or biggest challenges that we've gotten a lot of federal funds coming into the city because of the 2015 floods, and that's been a challenge because a lot of the federal funding says you cannot put this money in the floodway. And we've had to explain to them that the money that we're putting into certain areas are not your typical floodway. And so that's caused a little bit of constraints on that funding, but we've gotten through some of that through some long discussions and explanations of why our maps are a little bit different than what they're used to seeing. So that's been probably one of the bigger hurdles. We've actually asked FEMA in the flood insurance studies to add some notes to clarify that, but that's still kind of an ongoing lessons learned that we're going. And that's it for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard. So we do have quite a few questions, but again, in the interest of time, I think we'll get right into Dave Carlton, excuse me, presentation on on his case study. So go ahead, Dave, take it away whenever you're ready. Slides look good.
Thanks. Let me get started here. Some of you may know this, most don't, but long time ago, I worked for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and when I left them, I went to King County, Washington, Department of Natural Resources also, or Surface Water Management Division, actually, by that time, in 1987. So this little bit of history. And King County basically adopted, it might back up here. Ooh, I have no control of my own slide.
So click on the slide deck itself.
There we go. But this no-rise floodway was adopted by the council in 1990, which basically they treat the entire special flood hazard area as a floodway, but it is not mapped. One reason it is not mapped is that the state of Washington has a prohibition on new residential structures in a FEMA floodway. So they still needed that FEMA 1-foot floodway in order to apply that requirement. This is just a map of King County. It is where Seattle is located, Bellevue, Lake Washington. It's a large county in western Washington. So Kwame River is our largest river. And as you can see here, it is, when it floods a mile or two across. But we also have a lot of very small streams. In 1987, a surface water utility was created basically to address smaller streams with frequent flooding, stream erosion, habitat degradation, and water quality issues. We had several floods, big rainstorms in the mid-'80s, and they got a lot of complaints throughout the entire county. Surface water utility was and still is responsible for basin planning. They would do watershed-based models to determine flood flows, stormwater management requirements. They designed and built detention facilities throughout the county. These are what we call regional detention facilities. They're not for a particular development, but they're typically done to solve existing flooding issues. We did a lot of bank protection, design and implementation to reduce erosion. They created a new stormwater management manual back in the early 90s, which is still in use today throughout all of Western Washington. It's been updated a little bit, but it was one of the primary reasons many communities in Western Washington get credit in the CRS program for the stormwater programs. They do a lot of complaint response and a lot of maintenance of their own facilities. So about 1987, 88, got new flood maps from FEMA. They needed to revise the ordinance. Planning department was responsible for revising the ordinance, and they happened to reach out to Larry Larson in the state of Wisconsin to ask about their no-rise floodway, which is actually how I got involved, as they referred planning department to me, because I was actually on King County staff at that time and had been on Wisconsin staff when they implemented that. But so they were interested. They were interested in doing something different, a higher standard throughout the entire county than what FEMA had. So they wanted more data on the impacts of what a 1-foot rise meant versus a no-rise floodway. So several of us, 4 of us, undertook a study to determine those impacts. So we studied 2 streams, Sioux Creek and Bear Creek, one in the north part of the county, one in the south. One was 17 square miles, the other 15.5 square miles, different levels of impervious surface. We did not look at climate change. We did not look at future development. We just looked at the impacts of filling in the flood fringe. This time we used the HEC2 models from FEMA for these streams. And we also used HSPF with 30 years of rainfall data to get flood flows, basically see what the volume of water was coming down the streams. We saw significant increases in both BFE, flood velocities, and peak flows. So Bear Creek, not a great increase in peak flow, but in Sioux Creek, we saw up to a 57% increase in peak flows at some cross sections. and that's a lot of increase. Again, Bear Creek, not a huge increase in the BFE if you fill the entire flood fringe, but Suze Creek, it was anywhere from 1 to 2 feet above the FEMA standard. And again, this is just filling the flood fringe. Does not account for any upstream development or anything like that. So velocity changes. King County, Western Washington in general, salmon are a critical species. So a lot of emphasis on restoring salmon habitat. So velocity changes to us mean degradation of the stream, a lot of erosion. It's just not something we wanted to see. And when you see something like Suze Creek averaged a 15% increase with almost a doubling of velocity in some locations, that started to catch people's attention. So we had rapid development at that time, and for quite a while afterwards throughout King County. A lot of small streams had significant existing problems with erosion and flooding. We wanted to be fair to existing property owners. And one of the other main talking points we were able to use with management was to determine what the volume of fill was that was necessary to fill the entire flood fringe, and then calculate how much it would cost to provide an equal amount of detention in these watersheds. And that really caught their attention because that was millions and millions of dollars, way beyond the budget we had at that time for doing projects. It was just coordination with the rest of SWIM. Since that time, they've made some minor changes. If you remember that picture of the Squamish River flooding, a lot of dairy farms out there. So what they allowed are now what we call critter pads on the larger rivers. These are just 100 by 100 foot square pads of fill, basically to get cows up above the flood elevation during large floods. Minor changes for public bridges because initially DOT, the county, all had to build, or when they redid bridges, they had to meet this no rise standard, which of course increased the cost significantly. Compensatory storage is now also required throughout the county. And between all these, it's limited floodplain development. We have not seen a huge increase in development in the floodplain. It's going elsewhere. So the status is basically 46% open space in the special flood hazard area. And we have a CRS class of 2 here in King County. And with that, now I want to talk a little bit about ASFPM's no adverse impact how-to guides. They have a lot of good ideas. As Tim mentioned earlier, King County did a lot of this work well before the creation of the CRS program, or about the same time as the creation of the CRS program. They did it because it was good for their community and not to get CRS points, but they did end up with a very high classification. ASFPM for a long time has had this philosophy of basically do no harm, don't harm your neighbor, no adverse impact, is what it's called. And they've developed these how-to guides. 2 of them are identified here: floodplain mapping and regulations and development standards. These are on the website. They have a lot of good ideas on how to do better than the FEMA minimum standards. For instance, you could require easements be obtained from property owners impacted by the surcharge, as done in Wisconsin. Risk assessments for hazard mitigation plans could include both existing flood conditions and future conditions with a surcharge or climate change or development, however you want to do it. You could allow a surcharge only if no structures are impacted, for instance. You could get a no adverse impact certification instead of a no rise certification. You could have a standard that calls for no increase in elevation, velocity, or erosion during a flood event. And we do see this in communities throughout the country, that they do have some standard for increase in velocity. They'll allow some minimum increase, but not very much. Managing development in the floodway better. And we talk about these surcharges, what we're talking about is cumulative impact. So it's not just a one-off development. It's what if everybody else got to do exactly what you're doing? So that's why we want cumulative encroachment analysis whenever you're looking at an analysis in a flood fringe or floodway. And that's just to be fair to everybody. Just because you're first doesn't mean you should get to use up all the flood storage, for instance. We have much better tools than what we used to have in the 1970s and 80s. We have two-dimensional models, provide great information on velocity in addition to conveyance. Unsteady models can analyze the loss of flood storage and what's the impact on downstream flood elevations, flood flows. Impacts on floodplain habitat should be analyzed. This is a big deal with FEMA. Currently, if you want a LOMAR, you have to do a habitat assessment to get your LOMAR, for instance, so we all should be doing something like this. And with this, here's our information, and I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back to Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Okay, so we're going to get into some question and answers right now. Before we do that, I just want to kind of calibrate everybody's expectations. We've got about 40 unanswered questions, so we're not going to have time to get to all of those. And what we do in that case is we'll take all the questions and get the responses from the presenters kind of in writing, and then we'll distribute that sort of transcribed Q&A at the time that we also distribute the slide deck and the recording and things like that. So if you asked a question, and you did not answer a question, get an answer to your question today, don't worry, we'll get that out to you with the other promised follow-up materials. So having wasted all that time, I do want to take a few minutes to answer a few questions and see if we can kind of get one from each area of the presentation today at least. And so Tim, we'll kind of start with the North Carolina case study. Richard was asking, you know, in the case of Charlotte, North Carolina, how did the community determine that the FEMA and future flood elevations were so much higher?
We did an independent outside consultant studied one of our watersheds, and we updated one watershed, updated the models, collected data based upon the new existing conditions, and then we took land use plans and other data that were forward-looking and overlaid them into the hydrology, and then ran all the statistics based upon the data sets that we had.
Okay, very good, fantastic. So the next question, and this may be, Alan, this may be for you, or potentially others could weigh in, but someone's just looking for a little bit of clarification on the 0 feet to 1 foot surcharge. The first presentation showed that the number of structures impacted increases to about 30% of the base value with a 1 foot surcharge. Is that based on estimated development in the fringe, based on historical rates, or what is that based on?
It's basically based on adding 1 foot of surcharge to BFE and seeing how far that extends up past the special flood hazard area. And then it's counting the number of structures that are impacted with building footprint data. So you've got the edge of the special flood hazard area, you count the number of structures that are in that, you add that 1 foot to extend that laterally out the edge of the special flood hazard area, and then you count the number of structures that are impacted with that scenario.
Cool. Okay, thank you, Alan. Thanks for clarifying that. Richard, we've got a Texas State alumni here. So Rachel, shout out to San Marcos, obviously. But Rachel's asking, do you offer any exceptions for homeowners wanting to do, say, a lateral addition when they're actually in the floodway fringe, but connected to the admin floodway? Sorry, Rachel, maybe there's a typo in there, but Richard, did you understand that question, or do you want me to reread it potentially?
No, I think she's saying when you're in your floodway fringe, but you're in the administrative floodway, can you develop within that area without as an exception? And I would I say no, any additions have to meet the standards in the floodplain. Additions have to be elevated, and the flood analysis would apply to the addition as well.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for. I think that was the correct interpretation there. So thank you for
Kevin,
taking that one.
I want to interject for a second. Just
Yeah.
want to highlight that, by the way, I think Kevin included the link to that outreach document that we prepared in your reminder for this webinar. So you can find that link there, and we'll also send the link when you get the final materials.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for mentioning that, Alan. I forgot to do so. So thank you for reminding me there. Appreciate that. And thanks, Richard, for that answer. So we've got a question here, Dave, related to King County and that case study. Are you able to elaborate more on how maintenance is and other construction, construction, linear transportation projects such as roads and bridges are handled under your floodplain regulations? Do you require a flood study, no rise, et cetera?
Basic maintenance is not required to do a no rise or anything, like an overlay on a road, for instance, basic maintenance on a bridge. Those are exempt from the requirements, but to replace a bridge, that is not exempt from the requirements. A new roadway is not exempt. The basic maintenance is.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Alan, we had one I just wanted to get to just as a quick one, just to kind of clarify, and then we'll unfortunately have to kind of wrap up after this one, and I'll have a few brief closing comments. But can you explain the without floodway in quotes and with floodway quote in quotes columns in the flood insurance study?
Yes, well, what that does is it shows that what your base flood elevation is, but then what that surcharge component is. Unfortunately, that surcharge is there for informational purposes, but it is not added to the base flood elevation, and so structures are not required to be elevated to include that surcharge, unless, of course, you have a community that has an ordinance that requires that, either freeboard or adds that to their base flood elevation.
Okay, I appreciate that explanation. So now we're going to get into our last poll question, which is just a rating of our webinar today. So if you could please weigh in with what you think. It's all totally anonymous, and it just kind of helps us calibrate future topics and offerings and future webinars overall. So take a minute to weigh in on that. And while you're sort of reading through those options, I just want to mention a few final admin items, because I know we've got a lot of promised follow-up here and a lot of information. We only have a couple of minutes left. So number one, I just want to mention, it's going to take us about a week to turn all these things around, but if you qualify for credit as a CFM, if you're a national CFM, you will get that in about a week applied to your records automatically. If you're in an accredited state, you'll want to take your certificate of attendance and provide that to your state organization. And along with that, we will be sending out those certificates of attendance in about a week, and that'll basically come with the recording, with the slides, with the transcribed Q&A, and then forgive me, Alan, I'm not remembering the outreach link, the name of that document, but that we'll be providing that as well. So it'll all come to you hopefully in one consolidated email, but it's going to take us about a week to get there. So just want to kind of set everybody's expectations on that front. And then just as a final word, thank you to you all for attending, taking time out of your afternoons and out of your busy schedules to join us and engage with us here. And thank you so much to Dave, Richard, Tim, and Alan for sharing these insights. We'll definitely take any questions that you have. If you had any that you didn't get into the question panel, if you want to send those to us via email, you can do that as well, and we'll take those also. So having said that, thank everybody again, and have a good afternoon. and a good rest of your week. Take care, everybody.